Sadly, the church is in decline today.
If truth does not exist, we will not be able to live and function as civilized individuals in a society.
Students in the public education system at large of our nation are left with the impression God's irrelevant because he's never mentioned.
We sort of have national Alzheimer's. Here we are, the freest country that the world has ever seen, with more individual freedom and opportunity to choose what you want to do with your life and where you want to go to church. We have that, and we forgot how we got here.
So we're going to answer the question, why all the fuss?
Despite ever-increasing efforts to undermine the authority and accuracy of God's Word, the Bible stands firm.
Science and the Bible are inextricably linked.
We see evidence of incredible design.
God has made it incredibly clear.
Men, listen to me today. God has a calling on your life. Kids need you. Women need you. Our country needs fathers and responsible husbands today.
55 out of 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Bible-believing, church-attending Christians.
We have the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world. The Western world was successful because it was built upon biblical values.
All right, well, how's the sound? Is that okay? Does that sound good? Okay. I never know because I'm deaf in one ear and I can never hear things at the proper sound level or in stereo for that matter. So anyway, so the title of my talk is Debunking Evolution and Improving Creation. And so this is just a basic talk where we kind of hit some of the highlights of several of the various evolutionary paradigms and show how they just flat out don't work, but that when you actually look at the scientific data, it supports the scriptures. So let me get my clicker fired up here. There we go. You know, the Bible actually commands us to study apologetics as best we can. And basically the things I'm going to be talking about in this talk, any of us can get up to speed on. And when we get in a conversation with a skeptic or an evolutionist or an agnostic, an atheist, whatever, if you will just study some of the basic things about creation science, you will be good to go for the most part. And so anyways, the Bible does command us to give a defense of our faith. And so 1 Peter 3:15 says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts. And of course, that's the first step. You have to sanctify God in your hearts. And always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. And of course, in this day and age, there's no shortage of people questioning us about the faith or asking us about the faith that is in us, from friends, from family, from coworkers, and so on. So what about this whole thing about science and evolution? And you know, evolutionists throw science around like it supports evolution. In other words, they use it as a synonym almost, but it's not. It's not at all. When evolutionists do that, they're not talking about basic science, like the basic laws of chemistry, the basic laws of physics, those kind of things. They're talking about theoretical, speculative evolution, which isn't science. It's all speculation. And so when we look at real science, it lines up completely with the scriptures. And that's what I've been trying to do as far as with my field in genetics and biology, and of course, the area that I've gotten into the past 10 years or so in paleontology. But we're going to kind of look at it in some other areas as well. And so we're going to talk about the origin of the universe, and we're going to get into some basic astronomy here that any of us can learn. I mean, if I can learn it, you can learn it. This crazy creationist biologist, right? And we're going to talk about the origin of life, which is literally the biggest problem for biological evolution. And then we're going to talk about the fossil record, because really a lot of our defense of the faith centers around the global flood and the fossil record, which does not support evolution. And so let's get right into it. So what do the evolutionists want us to believe? Well, they want us to believe that 13.7 billion years ago, the universe magically exploded into existence from nothing. They also want you to believe that 4.6 billion years ago, somehow in the aftermath of this explosion, the Earth somehow evolved. And all of this was because of time, lots of it, chance, random processes, totally purposeless and mindless. That's what they want you to believe. So let's get off here with the universe supposedly exploding into existence. From nothing to the Big Bang. And of course, most evolutionists now promote this idea of the Big Bang. Well, in order to have a Big Bang, we need something, matter/energy, to go bang. So who brought the firecracker to the whole thing to begin with, right? Where did this original material originate? And to dismiss or ignore this question means you have a story with absolutely no foundation whatsoever. And you know what? It's not just crazy creationists like me saying this. Very famous astronomers, in moments of being candid and honest, have admitted this as well. And so here is Paul Davies. He was a very famous astrophysicist and evolutionist at Arizona State University. And he actually wrote a book, The Edge of Infinity, on this very subject. And he admitted this in the book, talking about the Big Bang. He said the Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden, abrupt flash of lawlessness. I love these quotes, that allowed something to come out of nothing. And get this, he says it represents a true miracle. So who's got more faith? You know, like the saying goes, it takes more faith to be an evolutionist really than it does a creationist. And it's amazing these guys admit this stuff, that literally push these ridiculous paradigms. Look at this quote from Joseph Silk, a very famous professor emeritus of astronomy. He was at the University of Oxford. He said, and he wrote a book on the Big Bang, and he said this: "It is only fair to say that we still have a theory without a beginning." Crazy, huh? So arguments for the Big Bang, what are the primary arguments for it? Well, the so-called apparent expansion of the universe, and number two, the cosmic background radiation, or CMB, which is supposed to be the afterglow, so to speak, of this big explosion. And so let's look at these things. So Dr. John Hartnett is actually an incredible astronomy researcher and a professor at a secular university at the University of Adelaide. He actually came through ICR about 10 years ago. He's just really a great guy, very intelligent man. And he said this: "It's impossible to conclude either way whether the universe is expanding or static. The evidence is equivocal." And then he said, but when in conflict with that, talking about the evolutionists, these evolutionary astronomers, when in conflict with that story, the Big Bang, the knobs are turned in the standard Big Bang model such that it can be made to fit any evidence. And a perfect description of this is now with the James Webb Space Telescope that has just gone up. They're now finding fully mature galaxies at the very edge of measurable space where they should not exist. And now the evolutionists are saying, oh, we need more than 13.7 billion years. Now they're wanting to double that number. And so that just shows you, trying to deal with these astronomers is like nailing Jello to the wall. I mean, literally, really double the age of the universe? Is that really good science? So obviously they've got some major problems with their model. So what about the cosmic background radiation? Does it really fit with the Big Bang? Well, the problem is that it's lumpy. It is not the same across the entire spectrum of it being measured across the universe. It should not be lumpy. It should not be lumpy at all. It should be consistently in line with a massive explosion. And so that in the past has created a lot of problems. And now we've got the James Webb Space Telescope creating even more problems for this Big Bang model. And so we have these mature spiral galaxies are being now found at the edge of space where they should not exist with the new James Webb Space Telescope. In fact, we're finding galaxy clusters that are just absolutely mind-blowing in all different shapes and all different sizes. They should not be there according to evolutionary theory at all. And the only thing that we can say really as Christians is, well, we told you so. We've got a mighty creator that created all of this. And of course, I think immediately of Psalm 19. Anyways, evolution. And so well, let's assume that somehow we did get some magical Big Bang and it created all this material. Well, how did all that material become planets and galaxies and solar systems? And, how did that even happen? Well, evolutionists claim that this all happened through accretion, which is what just almost as outrageous as the Big Bang model itself. So they claim that the accumulation of particles and gas into a massive object by gravitationally attracting more matter came into an accretion disk. And this was talked about earlier today, how that totally defies the laws of basic physics. So I'm not even going to say any more on that. Hopefully all of you were here when that was discussed earlier. I think it was Bruce Malone talked about that, right? So anyways, that was a great message he had there. So galaxies, stars, and planets are believed to have formed by accretion processes until now. And let me explain why that's the case. So accretion theory is based on scientists just observing our own solar system. So when we look at our solar system, we see the sun, and when we look at the planets that are orbiting around it, smaller planets orbit around the sun closer, and the larger gas giants further away. And these smaller planets orbiting the sun much more closer are very dense, whereas these large planets, these gas giants, are further away. And all of the planets in our solar system have fairly circular orbits. And so evolutionists looked at our solar system and said, hey, well, that makes sense, right? Stuff closer to the sun is smaller, it's more dense. As you get further away from the sun, it's more gaseous. Oh, that sounds like an accretion disk, right? Everything's moving in a nice circular fashion. Well, does that really apply to the rest of the universe? Well, it turns out, starting in the mid-1990s, so this isn't that long ago, astronomers started finding exoplanets, and the exoplanet is nothing more than a planet outside our own solar system. And I actually have an entire talk on exoplanets, which is just really it's the most fun talks I really give. I'm not giving it here, but anyways. So, astronomers started finding exoplanets outside our solar system which look nothing like those in our solar system. In fact, gas giants the size of Jupiter they found in some places out in the universe whipped around their stars in tiny orbits like the very rocky, dense planets do in our solar system. Anyways, they whipped around their stars in tiny orbits where they shouldn't even be, where accretion theory says gas giants were impossible. They shouldn't be there according to their speculation. Other exoplanets traced out extreme elliptical orbits, not circular, and some even looped around their stars' poles. In other words, they're moving in the wrong direction, according to the evolutionists. Planetary systems, it seemed, could take any shape that did not violate the laws of physics, but they're certainly violating all these presumptions made on accretion theory based on our solar system. Here was an article published in 2014. The title of it was Astronomy, Planets in Chaos. So the discovery of thousands of star systems, they say in this article, wildly different from our own, has demolished ideas about how planets form. These are astronomers saying this about accretion theory. Demolished ideas about how planets form. Astronomers are searching for a whole new theory. And then it goes, and then here's another quote. This is from Norm Murray at the Canadian Institute for Theoretical Astrophysics in Toronto at about the same time this came out here. He says, the field in its current state doesn't make much sense. And then here's another quote, and this is from Kevin Schlafman, an astrophysicist at MIT in Cambridge, and he says, it's impossible right now to account for everything. Impossible. Here is another article here published in 2018. These dusty young stars are changing the rules of planet building, meaning accretion theory. Such ideas, meaning accretion theory, this is a quote from this article, and by the way, this was in Nature, one of the top journals in the world. Such ideas about accretion theory have been in turmoil ever since astronomers started discovering planets around distant stars, meaning exoplanets, a list that now numbers in the thousands. The solar system has rocky planets near the sun and giant gas balls farther out, but the panoply of exoplanets obeys no tidy patterns. So what they're observing in the rest of the universe is pretty much just destroying accretion theory, which is basic nonsense to begin with. It's just common sense tells you that's absolute nonsense anyways. One of the big problems, though, is explosions do not produce order. No viable explanation for how stars, planets, solar systems, and galaxies could have formed in the aftermath of the blast of a Big Bang. Another issue here is what's known as the Goldilocks principle, and all of this basically points to our solar system being uniquely designed for life by our mighty Creator God. And I'm just going to list a few things. I mean, this is just like a fraction of the things. We could go on for hours talking about this, but this is just a few of the major points here. Our sun is just the right color to enable photosynthesis. And so photosynthesis is the process that goes on in plants to make carbohydrates and energy, which is the foundation of life on our planet. If our sun was any other color and it emitted a different spectrum of light, photosynthesis would not be possible. And suns or stars come in all different kinds of colors. And so ours is just the perfect color. On top of that, our sun is just the right mass or just the right size. If it was larger, there would be too much high energy radiation and everything would get fried here on Earth. If it was smaller, the range of planetary distance able to support life would be too narrow and it would be too cold here. And now let's talk about our Earth. Our Earth is the perfect distance for a stable water cycle to occur. If it was too far away, water would freeze too close and water would boil. Wouldn't that be a bummer? And so Earth's gravity is absolutely at the perfect level. We have the perfect axial tilt for Earth. The rotation period is absolutely perfect for life. The magnetic field is just right. The thickness of the Earth's crust is just perfect for life. The oxygen-nitrogen ratio is absolutely perfect for biological life here on Earth. The carbon dioxide level as well, because plants need carbon dioxide. All these climate guys are going to tell you carbon dioxide is really evil. Well, if we didn't have it, we'd all be dead, because because plants absolutely need carbon dioxide to function and live. In fact, greenhouse growers actually put carbon dioxide tanks inside the greenhouses to increase the level of carbon dioxide, to increase the production of whatever they're growing, whether it's tomatoes or strawberries or roses, whatever. And so that's absolutely critical. The water vapor and ozone levels in our atmosphere are just right, and we could just go on and on and on here. Now let's get into biological evolution and explain why that is a major problem. So, as I said earlier, evolutionists think the Earth somehow magically, through accretion theory, evolved 4.6 billion years ago. They think that 3.6 billion years ago, the first cells magically popped into existence. And 3 to 6 million years ago, they think we evolved from apes, which is just a fraction of time compared to all this other nonsense. And of course, everything due to time, chance, random processes. Isn't that ridiculous? Let's look at the model of biological evolution. Well, supposedly chemicals, all of the biological chemicals that we need for life, magically formed in some sort of a primordial soup. And there's so many theories on where this could have happened. It's just off the charts. The chemicals somehow polymerized or bonded together to form large biomolecules, which is absolutely impossible to occur without specialized cellular machinery and enzymes to do that. Somehow these molecules came together to form cells. Single cells then somehow evolved into multicellular creatures, and then multicellular creatures evolved into the diversity of life that we see all over the Earth today, and that are also present in the fossils that were buried in the global flood. So how did life get going to begin with? Well, really, you've only got two options here, only two. Either life evolved by natural processes through materialism, or, which basically is based on evolution, time, chance, random processes somehow magically equals life, or life was created by a creator. There's no other options here. Either life created itself, or a creator created it. What are you going to believe? And so literally the closest they have ever come to creating a scenario where they think that biomolecules could have somehow randomly appeared was actually through this highly engineered, contrived contraption that they created in the 1950s, and it's called the Miller-Urey experiments. And so essentially is what they had was this contraption where they boiled this concoction of ammonium, water, and methane, and then they essentially boiled it. It went up through this tube and then into this chamber where there was essentially a spark that basically went off and then created a reaction there through the spark, and then that was condensed, and then that condensed material then went into a trap. And if they had not had that trap there, that material would have just cycled back through and been destroyed. And so, does this really represent some sort of a primitive primordial soup, or is this like a completely engineered contraption that is highly fine-tuned to produce some sort of a result? Well, this isn't evolution at all. But even the material they produced from this thing doesn't support evolution whatsoever. So they got minuscule amounts, I mean really small amounts, of only a portion of only the simplest amino acids needed for life. And so we need 22 different amino acids for life, and hardly any of them are simple. Only a few are very simple. Most amino acids have these really complex side chains that you cannot even create through this kind of a process. But on top of that, amino acids come in both left-handed and right-handed versions. So if you hold your hands together like this, you've got either a left-handed or a right-handed version of it. But your body biological systems can only use left-handed amino acids. They cannot use right-handed ones, but yet this process produced a combination of both, which would have completely mucked up any sort of a biological process going on needed to polymerize these things. And the experimental conditions destroyed these primitive amino acids as fast as it made them. So really, in reality, we have kind of something like a chicken or an egg thing going on here. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Actually, it's even worse than that, because that's really just a two-factor problem there. Really, we have at least a three-factor problem, but it's even worse than that, because we're going to talk about other biomolecules that cells need as well. So anyways, you need DNA as kind of the central place that contains the information that code for proteins, and however, you need proteins to make DNA, to replicate DNA, and to create DNA. And also, you need RNA. And so RNA is copied from DNA to make proteins, and so, but you need proteins to make RNA. And so all of these things depend on each other. So you have actually something, you have these three different factors. It's worse than what came first, a chicken or an egg. And I remember when I was at Clemson University, I was actually working there as a professor, and I was interacting with a Chinese graduate student. He was in the genetics program there. And I remember him basically bringing this up. I didn't even bring it up myself. And he said, yeah, he said this whole origin of life thing, it's really a problem. It's like a chicken or the egg thing. What came first? And this guy even thought of this himself without any prompting, because he knew in his own mind that, hey, this is a major problem. Interestingly enough, Sir Fred Hoyle was an astrophysicist, and he actually recognized the problem going on here. And he said, and he actually tried to calculate the odds of a single protein, the most simple protein possible known in life, arising by chance at 1 in 10 to the 40,000, which is essentially impossible. But that same probability they determined was the same chance that a tornado would go through a junkyard and leave behind a Boeing 747 full of fuel and ready to fly. That was the same probability. It was just the most simple protein arising by chance. But you know, life requires more than just RNA, DNA, and protein, which, by the way, is all based on information, right? So you just cannot have some random sequence of amino acids and expect it to do anything, or DNA or RNA for that matter. It has to be specific engineered code. However, what else do cells need? Well, cells need membranes to surround everything inside the cell and to contain that. They also need, and you need lipids, or fats and lipids for that. And you also need lipids for metabolism in the cell. And so we didn't even mention that. We talked about the three-way problem, right? DNA, RNA, proteins, but you also need lipids. You also need carbohydrates, which are complex sugar molecules, and you even need simple sugar molecules as well for metabolism, for cell signaling, and to create cell walls, because bacteria have a cell wall in addition to the cell membrane. Fungi have cell walls, and plants have cell walls. If plants didn't have cell walls, they'd just flop over on the ground and they'd be useless. You need a cell wall to create structure. And so also carbohydrates. So like I say, it's worse. It's worse than just that three-way factor situation. But believe it or not, evolutionists have so much faith that they think this could actually somehow result in a cell coming together if they just added all these things together. And so this guy here, his name is David Deamer, and he actually... Does that mean we're all supposed to stand up? There you go. That happened to me the last talk. What's going on here? I'm already standing. So anyways, David Deamer is, he's considered to be one of the world's leading origin of life researchers. And anyways, this guy has a lot of faith, I'm telling you. He actually wrote this book called First Life, which I've actually read. And anyways, he says David Deamer actually put all of the things needed for a cell into a beaker and then dumped them into a mud puddle, thinking they would all self-assemble into a real cell. I'm serious. And here's a picture of him doing it. And listen what he said about this. He said, the results are surprising and in some ways disappointing. It seems that hot acidic waters containing clay do not provide the right conditions for chemicals to assemble themselves into pioneer organisms. So he had a beaker full of lipids and carbohydrates and DNA and RNA and proteins, and he thought if he just dumped them into a mud puddle, he'd get a cell. I mean, come on. And he was actually surprised it didn't happen. Anyways, let's move on here. So Charles Darwin invented his theory that somehow life evolved from, and Charles Darwin actually speculated that life may have evolved in some warm little pond, as he said it. And so that's where that whole idea actually came from, because even Charles Darwin realized something had to start somewhere, right? We had to get some cell popping out magically from somewhere. So he actually proposed that whole idea, and then he claimed that somehow through his theory of evolution, that would lead to everything that's on Earth today. And I showed this earlier. So that's what evolutionists actually believe, that somehow a cell magically came together from all these biomolecules that somehow popped into existence and self-assembled, which is utterly impossible, and that it branched off into plants and animals and eventually humans. And of course, that's what evolutionists believe. But the Bible tells us the truth, and that is that God created everything after its kind, and humans in the image of God. And I've shown this multiple times. This evolutionary tree is pure fiction. What we really see in the real world is a creation orchard. And so when we look around us, we see creatures with a lot of variation within their kind, like dogs. And that's why dogs, we've bred dogs to such extremes where there's Great Danes and little Chihuahuas, and yet they're still dogs. And yet you can even get dogs to breed with coyotes and wolves, and they're just dogs. In fact, they're even seeing that in the wild now. Coyotes and wolves are actually breeding together. And so, by the way, I might say one of my first dogs as a young man in my early 20s was a dog that was half wolf, half black lab. And he was quite an interesting dog, but also one of the most friendly dogs I've ever met. I was like, where's the wolf in this thing? If a robber came to my house and I wasn't there, he'd probably open the door and show him everything, So anyways, it wasn't much of a watchdog. So we do not see any evolution in the past. As I said before in the talk I did on the fossil record, we see things appear suddenly, fully formed with no previous ancestors. Creatures stay the same, which is stasis. In other words, they might show up in the fossil record and then show up again maybe in an upper layer, or they might still be alive today. They look exactly the same, no evolution going on there, and no transitional forms in the fossil record whatsoever. And of course, I showed this quote earlier, but it's really worth giving again because it's such a great quote from Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of the most famous evolutionists of the 20th century, and also one of the most candid. He said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. And I've showed these pictures in a previous talk, but they're worth doing again here for this. So here's a shield bug, supposedly 50 million years old. What does it look like? A modern living shield bug. Hasn't changed one bit. It showed up suddenly in the fossil record with no previous no previous precursors, and animals do not change. Here's a coelacanth that showed up in the fossil record supposedly 65 million years ago, and they discovered these things alive in the early 1900s when a fisherman pulled one up off the coast of South Africa, and evolutionists were absolutely freaked out. It totally wrecked their whole evolutionary paradigm, because coelacanths, because of the way their fins are not connected directly inside in their body to any other bone, they thought, oh, well, this thing could have been the first creature to walk on land. This could be a transitional creature that started walking on land. Well, it turns out they live 300 to 500 feet below the surface of the ocean. They aren't even close to land. And in fact, they're designed to do that because they've got a specially engineered swim bladder inside them that keeps them at that depth. And when you pull them up above that depth, it kills them. And so not only did this wreck sort of the evolutionary sea to land transition, but also these show up suddenly, fully formed, with no precursors, and they look exactly the same as they are today. And now we're actually pulling up coelacanths and sequencing the coelacanth genome, which has just been done, I would say, about 4 or 5 years ago, which totally defied evolution when they sequenced its genome. It didn't make any sense in light of evolution, but it does when you know that a creator created it and engineered it. And lobsters look exactly, this is a lobster that showed up suddenly in the fossil record 100 plus million years ago, a very complex underwater arthropod. And what does it look like? It looks like what you eat for lunch, right? It looks exactly the same. And so no change there. Frogs, they look exactly the same as they do in the fossil record where they first showed up 350 million years ago. And here is a horseshoe crab, allegedly in the fossil record 400 plus million years old in the Cambrian rock layer, which is the very first rock layer in the fossiliferous rock record. And now, what does it look like? It looks exactly like living horseshoe crabs today, which are actually being exploited for the biomedical industry because of their blue blood, which they use for various biomedical applications. But it looks exactly the same. In brittle stars, they show up. And by the way, here's a wonderful image of brittle star fossils buried in mass, which directly points to a global flood, because a lot of these fossils you see buried with these in large populations in mass. And the best way to explain that is a massive catastrophe. And so anyways, brittle stars are still alive today. In fact, they're very interesting complex predators. You can see YouTube videos on them, and they're like really amazing. But they're still alive today, look exactly the same. And look at all these creatures that are preserved in amber. And so how would creatures get preserved in amber? Well, during the global flood, all these forests and trees were being ripped up. All this resin was floating around in the ocean and the water, the flood waters, and creatures are getting stuck in the resin, and then the resin gets buried in these sedimentary rocks and ends up forming these hard amber fossils with creatures within them. And what's really cool is that you can look into these amber fossils and you can see these creatures in just exquisite detail, just like when they were living. And they look exactly like modern creatures. So there's a cricket and there's a scorpion, and you can see them. You can look right in there and see the thing just like it did when it looked like when it was alive, and it looks exactly the same. And so the global geological evidence for the flood, well, more than 70% of the earth is covered with flood-based rocks. What does that tell you? Sandstone, limestone, and shale. Marine fossils are found at the top of mountains and in every layer of the geological column. Remember, we talked about marine mixing in my Fossils Say No talk. We literally find land and marine creatures buried together above the first few layers, which were completely marine because the flood started in the oceans. Only cataclysmic processes can account for the many types of geological features all over the earth, which myself and others here have been talking about for the past day and a half. Why are there billions of dead, buried things all over the earth anyways? Why do we even have fossils? Because we had a global cataclysm, a global flood. And of course, organic matter and soft tissues indicate they were buried in the biblical timeline of about 4,300 years ago. And it's amazing, all the stuff from biology, whether it's soft tissues, biomolecules, and fossils, all the way to DNA, how it all supports a biblical timeline. So why do we have these massive fossil graveyards anyways? I don't know if you've ever been to Dinosaur National Monument. I was there in 2023 for the first time. It's just amazing. It just screams global flood. All these dinosaurs just heaped in and buried together. Absolutely amazing. But we see this all over the world. So here's some fossils. Here's a fossil, some fossils from China called Kaichiosaurus huey, and was in the Triassic unit. And look at all these marine reptiles, and they're about roughly 6 to 8 feet long, all perfectly preserved and all buried together, like they were all swimming in mass together and suddenly got buried together. And look at these trilobites in the Devonian. I mean, they're just heaped upon each other, just massively buried in mass. It just screams global flood. But and then also, how do you get all these very fine, soft structures completely preserved? They have to be very, very quickly and compressed very quickly. Look at all these fossil flowers. Well, you know what happens to a flower. You get your wife a batch of flowers for Valentine's Day or whatever, and they're gone within a few weeks, right? They just crumble up and disappear. But look at this. Absolutely amazing. We have all kinds of fossil flowers buried all over the world that are just absolutely beautiful. And soft-bodied creatures, like squids and octopuses. They actually took the ink from this octopus that was so well preserved and wrote a letter with it afterwards. And then you've got fish eating other fish. You've got an ichthyosaur giving birth to a baby ichthyosaur. You know, creatures getting literally caught in the act of eating something or giving birth. Here's one of my favorite ones. National Geographic had this up on their website. And so it's kind of hard to see there what that is, but then they created a schematic of the layout of the fossil, and then they created this picture. And so essentially, this snake was eating sauropod eggs and got buried in the process of doing it. Isn't that amazing? And then we have the soft tissue stuff, which we've been talking about, that has been discovered in dinosaur bones. And here's a T-Rex, a blood vessel with a blood cell in it, perfectly preserved. These bone cells called osteocytes with filopodia, those little things that branches, these fingers that stick out, that normally would break off very easily, perfectly preserved. And then the geological column just screams global flood. But what do evolutionists see when they look at the geological column? Well, they date it based on circular reasoning and evolution. And so they have what they call index fossils that they find in various layers. And they say, based on the index fossils, this is how old this layer is. And so what dates what? Do the rocks date the fossils, or do the fossils date the rocks? And so it's very circular. But at the very beginning of the fossil record, we have very complex body plans just showing up massively with all the major phyla of life showing up there with no evolutionary precursors. And I highly recommend getting Tim Clarey's book out there, Carved in Stone, if there's any left. If there's not, you can order it from our website. He's our resident geologist who has been mapping out the global flood. But he is showing that these massive, what he calls mega sequences, which is if you're in the oil and gas business, that's what you go by, is mega sequences, 6 major mega sequences. And look at these things cover entire continents. And he's found this on every major continent across the entire world now. And so it's pretty common sense how this all came about. You've got marine creatures being buried first in the global flood because it was a progressive flood. It occurred over an entire year. And so you've got marine creatures being buried first, then the floodwaters from the oceans begin slamming into land, and then you start seeing stuff in these coastal lowlands getting buried, all kinds of tropical type vegetation, insects and lizards and amphibians and things like that. And then as the floodwaters get higher, then you see creatures being buried at higher elevations in more temperate zones. And then this is one of the most favorite things I love showing skeptics. Here are these polystrate fossil trees, and they're all over the world. And so these are trees that go up through multiple sedimentary layers. So what happens to a tree out in the woods? It decomposes and falls apart, right? It doesn't wait around millions of years to get buried by sediments. And so this is like one of the elephants in the room here, these polystrate fossil trees, but it shows these layers were formed rapidly. Here's another polystrate fossil tree originating in a coal layer and then moving on up through sandstone. And so these things are absolutely scream global flood. And then you've got rock layers that are folded and not fractured. Well, how do you fold a rock layer? Well, you fold it while it's soft. And the global flood had all kinds of tectonic activity going on while these layers were being laid down. And so after they were laid down, many of them were actually folded. And here's one that's actually a 90-degree fold, and there's a couple of people there circled to show you just the size of this. And then on top of that, we have no erosion between layers. In other words, we have one right upon another. You can only do that sequentially in a progressive global flood. And then, of course, I'm wrapping it up here. The Mount St. Helens eruption was like a great outdoor lab on catastrophe. And so several years after Mount St. Helens had erupted and spewed forth a lot of different ash layers and various layers, Spirit Lake burst, and when it burst, it carved through all of these layers, which were still relatively soft, and it formed these canyons that look exactly like miniature Grand Canyons. And there are some people standing there at the bottom of this canyon, and other talks have already talked about this, so I'm not going to get too into this. And there's another person there showing you the scale of this, absolutely amazing. All kinds of fine scale layering, as well as different large strata units. And so what a perfect example of how you can form these canyons. And actually, Dr. Clarey has a wonderful article up on our website. I don't know if it's in his book, but he has literally analyzed these massive canyons like the Grand Canyon, the Palo Duro Canyon in Texas, and these canyons all over the earth, showing how they were all formed at the same time during the flood runoff phase of the global flood. So anyways, we have lots of data, right? We have data from biology, from geology, all these different sources, from astronomy. And so how do we interpret that data? Are we going to look at that through the lens of evolution, or are we going to look at it through creation? And what does the data really point to? What does it better support? Well, obviously it supports the Bible much better, not billions of years of evolution, and not naturalism, time, chance, and random processes. No, it supports creation and a biblical timeline. And I think both are very important, because now we have all these theologians caving into all this deep time, messing up the Bible, messing up the fact that we need, a literal Adam and a second Adam, and they're all both tied together in the Bible by chronologies and genealogies and lots of other important things. It breaks the cohesion of the Bible when you give into this nonsense. So anyways, creation is hands down the winner there when we look at the data. And I love this. Another person, I think it was Bruce Malone, talked about this. How do you remember all this? So you could think of the 7 C's of history. We have creation. Everything was created wonderful in the beginning. And then corruption. Adam and Eve rebelled and brought sin, death, and corruption into the world, as well as total depravity in humans. Then we have the catastrophe of the global flood, which is roughly about 1,700 years after creation. And then we have the confusion, or the Tower of Babel. Remember, I talked about that earlier, and how that explains all the different people groups on the earth. And then we have Christ coming in the fullness of time, 4,000 years after creation, to die for the sins of man and to redeem us at the cross. And then we have the consummation cross, obviously, the 6th C there, and then we're eventually going to have the consummation of all things where Christ comes back. So anyways, and on top of that, we have these detailed chronologies and genealogies, not only throughout the Old Testament, in Genesis, the books of Chronicles, and all these other places, but also in the New Testament. 2 of the Gospels have very important chronologies in them, connecting Christ, one back to Abraham, the other connecting literally Christ back to Adam. So anyway, here's a little cartoon that kind of sums things up. So the evolutionists claim, everything is millions of years old. And you have these secular scientists saying, the Bible is not true. The earth is millions of years old. I'm a scientist, believe me. And then you have these theologians saying, well, I have to add what he says to the Bible. He must know what he's talking about, right? Well, believe me, I worked in academia for 20 years. They don't know what they're talking about. It truly is a religion. And it's like you have this evolutionary magic rug of deep time. So all of these different problems the evolutionists have there. And so the design of living things, no fossil transitions, no mechanism for evolution, order in the universe. Well, we'll just sweep it all under the rug of deep time. That makes it magical. In fact, evolutionists even say this. So this is George Wald. He was a Nobel laureate in physics and chemistry. And he said this: time is in fact the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, and the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs miracles. You can't say it any better than that, right? And so evolution really is a religious belief system. It must be accepted by faith. Believe me, I have worked in academia for 20 plus years. I know these people have a faith called evolution. Pure speculation, but it's their faith. It is a belief system, and it must be accepted by faith. And here I'm going to wrap up here. So anyways, John Dunphy, he wrote this actually back in the 1980s. This kind of fits in with the history here we've been talking about, as well as creation. He said this: I am convinced that the battleground for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public classroom. Now, he's talking from the wrong side of things. By teachers who correctly perceive their role as the proselytizers of a new faith. He's talking about evolution, a faith. He literally calls it that. So what's the logical deduction to everything I've just presented? Well, obviously, if you're rational and reasonable, you cast aside all your presuppositions. You have to believe that there is a God, that he created everything, not all these unknown random chance events, right? The Bible is absolutely true. And so here's some books. I don't know how much are left out there, but I've got the Chimps and Human books, and that's a book on everything related to human and chimp supposed evolution from a molecular DNA perspective, the complexity, design and complexity of the cell. That speaks for itself. Fossils Still Say No. That's a fairly recent book I just put out, very key to understanding the global flood, and not only why we see fossils appearing suddenly in stasis, but why we see fossils in the layers where we see them. And also we have Creation Basics and Beyond, which is kind of a one-stop go-to for creation science. We have a Discovery Center in Dallas, Texas. If you get through there, stop in there, and hey, if you're at the front desk, say, hey, I know Jeff Tomkins. Tell him I'm here, and if I'm there, I'll come over and say hi. So anyways, we have a bi-monthly magazine called Acts and Facts, and you can sign up for that. It's a beautiful, glossy magazine. All of our scientists put articles in there, and a lot of them end up actually being in books. So if you get this magazine, you kind of get the first dibs on these new articles that are being written. And so here is a here is a code you can scan to sign up for Acts and Facts, and you can also sign up for this devotional that comes twice a year, which is really good. Most of the devotions in there were written by our founder, Henry Morris II, who was an absolute genius, really the father of the modern creation science movement, as it were, and also not only a great scientist, but a great theologian as well. So anyways, that's it, and thank you for your time.